So now we'll be moving into a different part of the event. Some of you might be wondering, what does the research say? And thankfully, we have an expert here tonight who will be speaking to that. So our next speaker is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at UBC, an adjunct professor of psychology at SFU, and a senior research fellow at the Forensic Psychiatric Services Commission at the BC Mental Health and Addiction Services. I was hoping I could do that all in one breath, but I just didn't do it. She is also a forensic psychologist with research interests at the intersection of law and mental health. Please welcome Dr. Tonia Nicholls.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, I wanted to begin by thanking Michael so much for the invitation. I understand this is the inaugural event at the UBC site. Is that accurate? So it's an honor. And I also wanted to acknowledge Michael and thank you for a provocative but also a very personal story. And I think it's brave. It's difficult to get up and do public speaking, period. It's never easy to get up and talk about your own personal history in that kind of context, so thank you. And the great thing is it really sets the stage and segues so nicely into sort of what I'm hoping to talk about today. So I was told I have 45 minutes. I'm a little bit like Michael. I do have a lot of information. Feel free if you have questions, to sort of interject, because I know we want to get through the material, but sometimes it's just easier to touch base at that point. I thought I'd start out by providing you with just a little bit of a backdrop about how we sort of got where we are, and I think Michael did an excellent job of providing that context and calling it sort of the predominant narrative. I won't spend much time on that, but I think it's an important place to begin. And then I'm going to provide you with what I call my top 10 hits, sort of tongue-in-cheek, obviously, but some of what I think to be the most important findings in the field that probably should have resulted in some pretty dramatic shifts in policies and practices and services, which, as you can see, is taking a very long time to actually evolve and occur, and part of why I think that is the case. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the implications are of the findings to date. Most of you are probably very familiar with the story of Hans Christian Andersen and the notion of the emperor who was duped by the weavers. So essentially, two con artists convict a vain emperor, convince him that they are providing him with the very finest cloth. And he marches through town then, essentially in his birthday suit. So he probably looks quite ridiculous, but the weavers have convinced the emperor and everyone in town that you can't see the cloth if you've risen above where you should be in life, in your station in life. So essentially, you're stupid, you're ridiculous if you can't see that fine suit that he's wearing. Right, so they're using bullying, condescension, essentially to convince people of their way of thinking. It took a small child, actually, in the story, the way that it goes, it's a small child who says the emperor is walking through town with only his underwear on. But I think there's a lot of parallels between that story and what's really evolved in the intimate partner violence field and public policies around this issue. A lot of similar pressures and tactics, if you will, have been used to brush the research, if you will, under the rug, to ignore, deny, to blame, to name call. And here we have some of the pioneers in the field. And I have been very, very fortunate in my life. I actually had the opportunity to meet Erin Pizzey, who opened the very first shelter for women in the UK. But to her credit, having started out acknowledging the issue from the perspective of women victims, began to hear the stories, probably stories very similar to Michael's, or maybe even a little bit different, where women were acknowledging their roles. And so she really started to advocate for the importance of a gender equality perspective in the work. Dr. Murray Strauss, who very sadly passed away within the last year. I think we actually just contacted him for some research and found out he's died. He actually came to Vancouver. I invited him to speak at a conference we had here. He did some of the most groundbreaking work, and I'm going to tell you a lot about that. Dr. Don Dutton was actually a mentor of mine. He's a professor here in the Department of Psychology. We published one of the first articles that really started to raise awareness in the issue. The notion of the emperor's clothes, though, where it really comes up is with respect to a lot of the work of Murray Strauss. So he would come to give a lecture like this, and people would come and protest, stamping their feet so that they couldn't speak. And eventually everybody would just go home. And so when I started doing this work, it left me feeling very anxious, thinking, and in fact, I asked Phil when he gave me the invitation, I wanted to know what kind of reception they'd been having if they'd had protesters, because you'd never quite know what to expect. The most extreme example of this is one of Dr. Strauss's colleagues had a bomb threat at his daughter's wedding. So that is the lengths that people have gone to keep this research out of the public eye, out of the media. Other examples, Dr. Strauss told me stories about how graduate students, if you are in academia at all, a lot of what I do is research. If you're in academia, you need research funding, or you don't have the opportunity to do research because you need assistance and you need to pay research staff and students and participants, and you need to publish. You've heard the term publish or perish, right? They were told, don't work with him. Funding agencies were told, if you fund research on male victims or female perpetrators, you will no longer be getting resources from our agency, for instance. So there's been a lot of effort to keep this hidden. We've already heard from Michael about the fact that there's sort of two perspectives right now. And I'm just going to call it the feminist, the radical feminist perspective for ease of language. I consider myself a feminist, so I think it's important to keep that in mind. But there's a long history of accepting that wife battering stemmed primarily from patriarchal privilege, essentially, patriarchal values. And what we're advocating from what we like to call a gender inclusive perspective is to acknowledge that intimate partner violence really reflects multiple etiologies: substance misuse, anger management problems, emotion dysregulation, a history of childhood maltreatment and trauma in both males and females. And we would advocate that really acknowledging that studying male victimization and female perpetration should hold this same importance as the opposite. I don't want to go into this. I would only add that I think we've tended to focus on financial abuse as well. I think Michael covered the categories quite well, and I don't think there's really much of a need to exaggerate that. The emotional examples that you gave were excellent. I think withholding sex, you could probably categorize as emotional abuse to some extent. There's also an important acknowledgement that we need to be thinking about not only heterosexual individuals, but gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning individuals and couples as well. I just want to begin by noting that when I talk about reciprocal aggression, I'm not necessarily trying to suggest that there is equivalence in terms of the severity of the outcomes, the frequency, or injuries, for instance. That's not always the case. A couple of pieces of terminology for you. I'm going to talk about a lot of research, but I want to give you the best evidence that there is. And if you think about a pyramid of science, Michael provided a wealth of information, and if you think about case histories, individual case histories, they provide us with a wealth of information from an individual perspective. So you get a richness, if you will. What we're focusing on as well tonight is to build on that and think about systematic reviews and meta-analyses where you are integrating across multiple studies, dozens, sometimes hundreds of studies, which allows you to take away finer grained knowledge of the bottom line. It reduces biases, for instance. There's been a lot of progress, despite the fact that there's a lot of challenges. After a lengthy period of time, intimate partner violence finally was acknowledged in about the 70s to be a major public issue. And that resulted in activist efforts like Erin Pizzey opening the first shelters. It resulted in changes in public policies, and it also resulted in a lot of research. And we know, for instance, that about 1 in 3 or 3 out of 10 individuals experience intimate partner violence. What resulted from that research is that most jurisdictions now require police to arrest a perpetrator, particularly if it's a male. We now have mandatory treatment programs for male perpetrators, and shelters for women became commonplace. And from those populations, a lot of research then followed. The problem is that when you sample people who are in shelters and you're only providing services for women, what are you going to hear about? You're going to hear about female victimization, right? And when you study perpetrators, but the only treatment for perpetrators that's being provided is for men, because we don't acknowledge that women are perpetrating IPV, you're only going to hear about male perpetration. And so essentially what you have is a sample selection, which results in biases and distorted results, obviously. Okay? And with that and the prevailing ideology at the time, this narrative that we have, it resulted in all of the public policy and the media attention and education that's evolved and the services to be focused around female perpetration. And to the extent that we acknowledged that female perpetration and male victimization even existed, it was deemed to be inconsequential, as Michael sort of articulated for us already. I'm going to show you what the top 10 list demonstrates according to the research, which is that there is very little evidence to support these conclusions. Okay? The first point is I have to acknowledge that I obviously didn't come up with the top 10 approach myself. Does anybody ever watch Letterman, or did you watch Letterman? He always has that top 10 countdown. And my professor, my PhD supervisor, Dr. James Ogloff, and Dr. Jennifer Lang and Richardson Rowling is actually in the IPV field. I think that's the litmus test for being an IPV researcher, is if you can say that name. Okay, hit number 1. Both men and women are both perpetrators and victims at similar rates and across the types and severities of IPV. We have well over 200 studies that demonstrate that men and women perpetrate intimate partner violence at roughly equivalent rates. Martin Fiebert is an American who keeps an annotated bibliography, and he's published it, as you can see here, about 4 times now, to my knowledge. So you can go online and you can see this body of research that is expanding over years and now decades, demonstrating that this finding is solid. In addition, like I said, we use meta-analyses and systematic reviews, and all that means is that you collapse across multiple studies so that you are more confident in your results. And I was involved in a really innovative project called the Partner Abuse State of Knowledge, and it was published in this new journal that my colleague started in the US. And we did 17 systematic reviews. Our systematic reviews focused on victimization and perpetration. So the first one that I wanted to tell you about is that men are the victims of intimate partner violence at rates comparable to women. We did a literature search and we found 249 separate publications which reported 543 rates. And I'm not going to bore you with all these details, but I want, for someone in the room who's critical of these perspectives, I want you to know this is solid research. There's a few things that you can see when you look at this. Most of the research is being done in the US, so Canada needs to sort of start contributing more to this. And then you'll also notice that there's very little research, or at least at the time, that's focused on male victims. So that's an important issue, right? We need to be funding this kind of work in order to demonstrate that there is good empirical evidence to support Michael's perspective, for instance. The bottom line is what we found is that 23% of women and 19% of men experience physical violence in an intimate relationship. So very comparable. Then we looked at the same approach and looked at perpetration. And again, we found dozens of studies, 111 separate publications. We did a very systematic approach. Again, most of the study is coming from the US. But what did we find? Again, 1 in 4 women, 28%, and 1 in 5 men report perpetrating intimate partner violence. So again, very similar rates. What does this suggest? What are the implications? Well, clearly, it underscores the need for interventions that address both female perpetration and female victimization, and male perpetration and male victimization. And I just wanted to show you, it doesn't matter how you look at this. Whether you look at different countries, whether you measure in different ways, whether you ask people about the past year of their life, whether you ask people about multiple relationships across their entire lifespan or just in the last year, or whether you look at different samples, what you can see is that with one exception, all of the rates on the outside column here is women, this is for men, and then this is the overall. And trust me, with the exception of one study in South Africa, in every instance, women reported higher rates of perpetration than men. The opposite of the wholesale we've been told by the media. Again, we need more research from other studies than just the US. We only had 6 Canadian studies. Interestingly, reciprocal abuse is the most common form that this tends to take. That's the most common pattern. So here we have a study demonstrating that reciprocal aggression is reported by about 50% of couples. The husband only is actually less common than the wife being the only perpetrator. I don't know why this is doing that. And what I wanted to show you is that this, again, has been demonstrated across multiple studies. There's an entire body of work to confirm this. Not only do men and women both engage in aggression, but women are just as likely to hit first. So it's not just the case that they're responding in self-defense, which was one of the myths that Michael spoke to. So when you ask men, they're equally likely to say that they struck the first blow or that she struck the first blow, 44%. If you ask women, they're actually more likely to say that they hit first than that they were hit first by their partner. Women are actually more likely to strike back in retaliation than men as well. Again, I just wanted to demonstrate multiple studies, a more recent project, similar findings. 58% here of intimate partner violence was reciprocal. Both parties were engaging in aggression. Okay. In addition, it doesn't matter what kind of aggression we tend to look at. Across different forms of abuse, sexual violence, physical aggression, psychological, and stalking. Now this is a government report, so they don't report. This might be a statistically significant difference here. I can't actually speak to that. Physical aggression and psychological was higher for male victimization. Women were more likely to be experiencing stalking or sexual victimization. But by and large, you can see the patterns are very similar. Hit number 2, and this comes back again to some of Michael's myths. Women do perpetrate serious violence, and he made excellent points. Despite the fact that women are smaller, they will often either wait until their partner is intoxicated, sleeping, or otherwise incapacitated, or they arm themselves with weapon to even the playing field. There's also the issue, you kept mentioning that she was smaller than you. But men feel compelled not to injure the smaller party, right? So they feel a responsibility to make sure that if there's reciprocal aggression going on, they're more likely to be worried about injuring the woman. Multiple studies and meta-analytic reviews demonstrate women commit higher rates of clinical level, or what we call severe IPV. In 91 empirical studies, clinical level or severe assaults such as punching, choking, attacking with objects, or any type of physical act which results in injuries is found more commonly in women. So 7% of women versus 5% of men perpetrate serious assaults. I do want to leave you with a couple of issues in mind, though. Despite that fact, when you look at clinical samples, individuals who have sought services, agencies, criminal justice intervention, police support, clinical samples who are seeing maybe a psychologist or in shelters, it's more likely that women are experiencing severe assault than men. So it underscores the fact that serious female perpetrated intimate partner violence exists. This is certainly not inconsequential, but the implications do remain greater for women when they're victimized. We've often been told that women are only aggressive in response to male perpetration, so the self-defense. But in fact, what you see when you look at different types of relationships is that women are more likely to perpetrate severe aggression against non-violent male partners, okay? So here we've got different types of relationships, dating couples, people who cohabitate or are married, and we've got male perpetrated severe violence, let's look at just the dating couples, at 0.1%, versus when the man is non-abusive and the woman is using severe aggression at almost 13%. And these trends are consistent across the different groups. So it's more likely the case that a woman is using serious violence against a non-violent partner than a man being seriously violent against a non-violent female partner. Number 3, both men and women suffer. Again, another one of the myths that Michael spoke to. Physical, psychological, financial implications are experienced both by men and women, and men's experiences are not inconsequential. The median percentage of individuals who injure a partner is higher for men than for women, but we're still talking about 7% of women resulting in some sort of injury to their partner. This is the CDC, the Center for Disease in the US. 81% of women and 35% of men who experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner violence report some form of personal injury. And Michael did a great job of talking about the emotional, the psychological, the physical implications, but there's also a lot of financial implications, which you sort of categorized as administrative and legal outcomes. What you can see here is, yes, the consequences do tend to be greater for female victims, but the diversity and the proportions of men who are reporting serious physical, mental health, psychological, financial implications is definitely substantial. So it's about 1 in 6 men say that they were concerned for their safety. Women do cause injuries. Again, often they're arming themselves. Women are more likely to be injured, but almost 40% of men who are physically assaulted by a female partner report being injured. And this is heterosexual relationships. This is not including gay relationships where those rates probably are even higher. It is therefore not the case that women's violence towards men severe enough to cause physical injury is negligible or non-existent. Male perpetrators do generate more injuries, though. I just wanted to make the point, if you're looking at mild to moderate aggression, so shoving, pushing, slapping, it's fairly equivalent, the injuries for both males and female partners. When you start looking at severe aggression, and I think that's where that physical differential between men and women, that physical power, especially the upper body strength, for instance, women are more likely to be injured or killed than men. When we talk about psychological or emotional and financial consequences, we know a lot less about that. And I think there's a need for more research there because it's really quite premature probably to draw conclusions yet. Number 4, the causes of intimate partner violence are varied but similar across the sexes. Women's motivations for perpetrating IPV, we've been told often it's all about self-defense. That's the only time women are aggressive, but in fact, motivations are quite similar. Not only do men and women perpetrate serious, diverse forms of aggression, the reason they do it look very similar. They are trying to coerce their partner to engage in some behavior they want them to do. They're angry, they're punishing their partner. All of the same reasons tend to be reported by both men and women. And as I've said, self-defense is actually quite uncommon. In one study done by Pearson in '97, 90% of women said that they were furious, jealous, or frustrated, and that's why they used aggression. 90% did not involve self-defense. Another study found that nearly identical proportions of men and women reported that they were using self-defense. That was their motivation, very similar for men and women at about 18%. And finally, in a study of couples who were presenting for marital therapy, 20% of wives and none of the husbands attributed their use of self-defense to aggression. As violence escalates, and that could be the case for why we've seen sort of higher percentages here for the women than for the men, as aggression gets more serious and injury is a greater risk, self-defense is more common for women. Hit number 5, patriarchal oppression is relevant. Coming back to those two sort of paradigms, that narrative that we've been talking about, patriarchal oppression is definitely relevant to intimate partner violence. If you think about sexist perceptions, misogyny, it's relevant to IPV, but it's only one explanation. And there's a couple of demonstrations in the literature for why we think this is so important. First of all, if you look at lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender relationships, the prevalence of intimate partner violence is actually quite comparable, and if anything, somewhat higher. And one interesting study actually demonstrated that women who'd been in both lesbian relationships and heterosexual relationships reported that their lesbian relationships were more violent than their heterosexual relationships. So that sort of takes the patriarchy out of the question, right? If I'm in a relationship with a woman, the abuse is probably not about patriarchy, right? Okay, so it doesn't seem that we can really explain intimate partner violence based only on gender roles or patriarchy. We've also looked at this from a couple of other different perspectives. Studies attributing IPV in North America to patriarchal causes have been disconfirmed. For instance, 2% of North American males say that it's permissible to hit your wife to keep her in line. That's not exactly a high proportion. Most North American marriages are no longer considered to be male dominant, and this actually is getting dated. It's probably even less common now. Contemporary North American societies are probably among the most egalitarian. So patriarchy is not a strong explanation. And then I bring you back to demonstrating that the male severe, female non-involvement in IPV is actually quite rare. Just 6% of couples who are violent demonstrate a wife battering pattern, which is sort of what we tend to hear about when we think about intimate partner violence. This is an important minority, but it by no means sort of is the typical pattern in IPV. General theories of violence, if we think about the reasons that people engage in criminality, aggression, or violence, the reasons for those actually overlap very well with the reasons that people engage in intimate partner violence. And this has important implications for treatment, for instance. Abusive and violent behaviors in women who engage in intimate partner violence actually are demonstrated early on in their life course. And again, it's a reflection of the things that I talked about earlier. The childhood maltreatment, the family dysfunction is already evident early on. It's not the case that these women are only engaging in violence after entering into an abusive relationship. So it's not that we can blame the male abuse for the female's use of aggression. This is a really nice study, fairly unique. 1998, this American group looked at people who'd been convicted of murder. And what they demonstrated is that men and women who killed their partners were equally likely to have violent criminal records preceding that event. Again, demonstrating that that history of antisociality, the anger dysfunction, often mental health problems, the emotion dysregulation that Michael spoke to is seen in a lot of different types of psychiatric disorders and populations, substance use problems, poor coping and general poor interpersonal skills. All of the reasons that people get in trouble with the law, have poor social relationships, is relevant to intimate partner violence. And the takeaway here is, I'm sort of stealing my own thunder, but this has major implications for how we treat couples, families, not just individuals who are experiencing IPV. It's not just about saying to somebody, you hate women. We need to restructure your schema about how you think about relationships and females and males in society. It's about acknowledging that maybe they have a history of childhood abuse, or maybe they have a serious alcohol abuse problem. Or maybe the female is actually the major perpetrator and he's the one that's using self-defense. So the response needs to reflect the etiology of the problem. I've sort of covered this. IPV perpetrators have substance use problems. Meta-analyses demonstrate that positive attitudes towards the use of violence are more common in people who engage in abuse in relationships, the same way that we would see in general criminal populations. Okay. Perhaps not so surprising then, unfortunately, all the money and efforts and resources that men may be jealous of that are going into the IPV field are actually not resulting in much good work. Batterer intervention programs are very sadly ineffective. Approximately 2/3 of men who complete a batterer intervention program avoid physically reassaulting their partner, but that's almost equivalent to the proportion of men who just stop being abusive. There is a cycle. Michael is absolutely correct. There is that sort of honeymoon phase, and then the initiation through the emotional, psychological abuse, which often then expands into physical abuse, and the financial and the control and social isolation, and then the sexual or physical abuse expands and continues. That cycle definitely is in existence. But in fact, a proportion of people who engage in this behavior do desist. And what we can see is actually it's at a rate that's fairly similar to people who've had treatment, because the treatment is not very effective. We've actually seen over 50 empirical studies showing that treated and untreated men reassault at about the same rate. Because I think we're not targeting the right issues. It's not that men hate, disrespect, don't love their wives. It's because they have poor coping skills, poor anger management strategies, because they're drinking too much or they're drugging too much, or because they're in an abusive relationship where she's engaging in abuse as well. And just finally, there is a very solid Cochrane review. We call it, again, a systematic approach, published in 2011, which demonstrated that cognitive behavioral therapy, the best psychological intervention that we have, even then, with over 2,000 participants, they concluded that the research is insufficient to draw conclusions. So sadly, we need to go back to the drawing board and really start to address intimate partner violence from an evidence-informed perspective. Number 8, male intimate partner violence does not always escalate. Recidivism and escalation has been overstated. And yes, that pattern does exist, but that's not always the case. And the reason I bring this up is because the predominant response that often women will get going to a shelter, for instance, or when they try to acknowledge that maybe they have a role in the dysfunctional relationship, is don't blame yourself. You're the victim here. You need to leave him. You need to end the relationship. And the majority of victims, whether it's males or females, they don't want to end the relationship typically. They want the violence to end, right? So simply telling somebody he's a bastard or she's a bitch, get out, he's a knuckle-dragging misogynist, that's not very helpful. And if we acknowledge that not all abuse escalates, and not all abuse is one party's fault or the other's, maybe we can start to get at helping to develop healthier families. And I'm not going to talk about this tonight, unfortunately, but the implications for children are clear. And child abuse, so not only witnessing intimate partner violence is obviously very traumatic for children. You were worried about your pet witnessing it, which of course would be extremely distressing to an animal for sure, but imagine children. So it's not only that, 50% of relationships where there's intimate partner violence, there's also overt child abuse happening as well. So in half of those situations, the children are also being physically, sexually, emotionally abused. And so the more that we start to do a better job of addressing this from a holistic perspective, the better we're going to do for children as well. So the research shows that de-escalation is more common than escalation. So helping women where they are in the relationship, not every relationship that's had an episode or even multiple episodes of abuse, even if it's physical, needs to end. Sometimes they are salvageable. And we're more likely to engage people in therapy and keep them engaged if when they go to a shelter, they're not told, you have to leave him, because they won't go back. Who's going to phone the police or go back to the shelter if they are just told that they're not handling the situation properly, right? So I would argue that recidivism and escalation really has been overstated. And there's good demonstrations of this. So for instance, in one study, they found that men who'd never been aggressive escalated to minor aggression at a rate of 2.6% when they followed them up a year later. Of men who had perpetrated one act of minor aggression, 6% had then escalated to serious aggression. So yes, you do see some increase in escalation and recidivism, but it's certainly not at the rates that I think the general population, the narrative that we tend to hear about this is described as. In particular, people who've perpetrated serious violence, the recidivism rate is even higher at 30%. There is little evidence that there is widespread approval, and again, this is coming back to that notion of the patriarchal perspective in the explanation. There's very little evidence that there is approval for using aggression against women. Surveys demonstrate that although awareness of the problem of IPV has increased, it extends primarily to female victims and to male perpetrators. And we need to start to educate people in the way that we're trying to do this evening about the other half of the story. When they looked at data from 75 to 85, we saw a substantial decline in approval for a man slapping his wife, but there was no change in approval for a woman using aggression against her male partner. And I always mean to do this, and I never have had a chance, but if anybody watches television, and I'm sure there's somebody in here who does, think about how many times between the hours of 7 and 9 or 10 o'clock at night on comedies, let alone dramas, how often do you see women strike male partners? And it's supposed to be funny. It's really quite distressing when you think about it. Just pay attention, because I've got my kids and my husband doing this now. It's shocking, punching, slapping, demeaning comments. A lot of the comedies now are around very capable, educated women and the doofus kind of husband. Everybody Loves Raymond. I can't think of the one now. He's got a new show. Kevin is the King of Queens, right? She was sort of the one that kind of held things together, and he was kind of silly. I don't think the aggression was so overt in that show, but there's a lot of those desperate housewives. In the introduction to the show, there was a scene where the woman punches the man. And it's just week after week, it's showing on the air. And what are we doing? We're educating men that this is acceptable, and we're educating women that it's acceptable, is really what's happening. And in fact, that's what you see in the data. Approval rates for women using aggression tend to be higher, and that's particularly the case if a woman hits a man. It's okay for her to strike him back. But even against non-aggressive individuals, approval of a man hitting a woman if she hits him first, 7.2% for women, 9.8% for men. Approval of a woman hitting a man to keep him in line is 5%. So if you think about, lining people up, 1 in 20 people think it's okay for me to hit my husband. Hit number 10, efforts to reduce intimate partner violence have really focused on only half the victims, obviously women, and half the perpetrators. So the resources that we need to bring to this issue, again, thinking even if you're having conversations with people who don't have a lot of empathy for male perpetrators, there's 2 takeaways that you can use. The one is the children. The other issue is that women who engage in retaliatory aggression or have reciprocal relationships that are abusive, the risk of the woman being injured escalates. So if you're finding people are primarily concerned, if it's funders, if it's Health Canada, if you find people are not responsive, even if we're focusing on women, it's still to their benefit to address male victimization. Okay. Okay, what do we see here? Declines in rates of actual partner violence show evidence of similar gender-related differences. So in 1975, there was the first National Family Violence Survey in the US, and they replicated it in 1985 using the same strategies. And somebody's trying to phone us. And they did it again in 1992. And basically what they saw was there was no change in women's use of aggression, but we had seen a substantial decrease in the rate of severe assaults on women by men. So we need to be changing the narrative here. 60% reduction in male perpetrated partner violence between 1993 and 2004 in the US. Some research actually showed there was an increase in the mid-2000s. In Canada, between 1999 and 2004, we saw male perpetration showed a decline, whereas female perpetration had remained stable. So we weren't doing a very good job. I do want to leave you with a couple of good notes, though. First of all, more recent Stats Canada data that actually has just recently been released shows that IPV rates dropped from 7% to 4%. So for people who were asked, have you been abused by a common law partner, your wife, your spouse, over the last 5 years, it dropped from 7% to 4%. That's pretty substantial because those are low numbers. It's hard to get reductions when you're getting down to low proportions. And what we saw was a similar decline for both men and women. So it seems like we've maybe hit a tipping point. And I think even the fact that we have the CAFE organization and this kind of conversation happening shows that we've sort of turned that corner. And another demonstrable way of looking at this is to look at, well, what proportion of studies are there on the issue generally, but also what you see is we're seeing more research. So from 2000 to 2010, there's a lot more interest and a lot more publications that are addressing both male perpetration, male victimization, and female perpetration and victimization. So just to wrap up, I think we need to be really mindful of the gap here between what the research shows and what we're doing in practice. We need to ensure that if a couple comes into therapy, it's acknowledged that both parties may have some roles and responsibilities here. That the prevailing theory that patriarchy is the primary driving force underneath any intimate partner violence is clearly flawed. This is not only a women's problem, this is a public health problem that we need to be addressing from an economic, sociocultural, child protectionist perspective. Any ideologically driven one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work. So you're going to have some couples wherein you are talking about the traditional severe male perpetrator, terroristic abuse, we sometimes call it, where you have a woman who is marginalized, captive, and needs protection. And then you are going to have relationships where it's more minor aggression and you really need to be dealing with both couples, and couples therapy is entirely appropriate. You probably are not going to engage in couples therapy where the woman wouldn't feel safe to have any conversation with the abuser in the room. But at the other end of the continuum, we need to be engaging both partners. So one size fits all just doesn't work. Prevention efforts need to be gender inclusive. We need to be thinking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, and queer groups as well. And we need to be cautious. I tried to present a balanced perspective tonight, you know, limiting the generalizability of the findings, acknowledging that there's not enough Canadian research yet. We didn't talk at all about ethnic minority groups, for instance. I think that's particularly a challenge when people immigrate and they don't know the predominant culture and the language. It's difficult to call 911 and ask for help. You're worried about being deported, for instance. So I just think we need to be really cautious about generalizing from the research that we have so far. And there's a lot more that can be done, for instance, looking at male psychological implications. Okay, I'll leave it there. I do need to acknowledge one conflict of interest, if you will. We do make money off of the sale of our book. Believe me, it's not like Harry Potter, we're not getting rich, but I do need to acknowledge that conflict. Thank you.